So what prompted the rise of Central Asian intellectuals as a political force, and what were their demands? Central Asian intellectuals, and here we're talking about cultural intellectuals, technical, academic elites, they were relatively quiet under the Soviet Union for the most part. There were relatively low numbers of dissidents in Central Asia compared to Russia proper, for example. Many joined the Communist Party, as they did in much of the Soviet Union and Central Europe, because this was a prerequisite for advancement. So finally, it wasn't until later in the Glasnost period, and later in the Perestroika Glasnost period, that they began to speak up. And in Central Asia, as around the rest of the Soviet Union, Perestroika and Glasnost first meant the rise of informal groups, people sharing common ideas. This was the rise again of these horizontal networks that the totalitarian state had tried to bury and had done a fairly poor job in Central Asia relative to other places. So in Central Asia, you began to find people sharing these common ideas, and this is also a period that we know of as the end of preference falsification. So by preference falsification, what we mean is where people would say one thing privately to that small group of people they trusted, and then they would say something quite different out in public, where they could be watched by the authorities and everyone else in society whom they had fairly little trust for because of the ransacking of these horizontal networks. So within Central Asia, we're talking about fairly large kinship networks where you could trust people. In other parts of the Soviet Union, we're talking about smaller family units, but still there's the rest of society that you don't trust. And preference falsification refers to this phenomenon where people out in public would say, hey, we love the communists, the communist regime is great, everything is peachy. And what that did is it created a situation where nobody knew if everybody else was actually supporting the communists or against them. They assumed that they were supporting them and that they and the people in their kinship network were a minority. So with Glasnost, with the opening up of openness, this preference falsification began to dissolve, and people's private interests were expressed in public. And everybody saw that they were more or less on the same page. Not everybody, but most of society, the have-nots who were the majority. By the late 1980s, intellectuals were much less cautious because they perceived fewer risks for expressing their private preferences. These weren't focused on democracy per se, it's important to mention, but they were politicized movements that expressed grievances. They had a background of nationalism. They were defending their people's interests versus the interests of Moscow. And so Central Asian opposition agendas tended to focus on these sorts of things. The environment. Think about the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea was drying up. You had the desertification of land. You had heavy industry, which was polluting everywhere. You had nuclear testing. You had biological and chemical weapons testing in Central Asia. Environment was a huge issue. And it was all across the Soviet Union. But it was a really galvanizing one in Central Asia in particular. You also had issues of housing, which were substandard. They were crowded. They weren't nearly enough. They tended to be given more to Slavs than to local nationalities. And so there was an issue there also that helped people galvanize the population. Language status was important because it represented other economic and social problems. Language was critical. Without language rights, people couldn't enjoy all the opportunities available that depended on knowing the language of power. So, for example, people needed to speak Russian to be in the bureaucracy, to be in most public institutions. To be a university professor, for example, you had to speak Russian. To be a factory manager, you had to speak Russian. And so, in practice, you can't really run a republic without knowing the local language either. In rural areas, for example, where there was less formal education, people would speak only the local languages. And it was very difficult to communicate with them without knowing these local languages. So language status was a big thing for the opposition elites. And then you also had broader cultural and religious freedom. Demands for more balanced views of history, for a reconsideration of the role of Islam. Religious freedom, in particular, was in high demand. You had the return of people learning Arabic script, and there was a demand to allow this in schools or in general. And note that another way Islam threatened the state and was thus resisted was that it was a package deal. It came with other social services like educational opportunities, charity work, or justice. But in particular here, we're talking about the educational system that people wanted to see reformed so that you could have more religious educational facilities out there that were not controlled by the state. So these were the sort of cultural and religious, ethnic-based demands. Also, along these lines, the literary field, people began to rehabilitate national writers. In other words, the victims of Stalinism, who for a long time intellectuals had ignored, they began to speak up for it and say, hey, this great poet was not an enemy of the state. This great poet was improperly, unjustly persecuted by the state, and now we're going to speak up for them. They often replaced borrowed Russian words with local words as part of this sort of attempt to elevate their own national status as well. So how did local Communist Party elites see the rise of these movements? It's actually a little bit complicated. It'd be easy to say that that they thought nationalism and the rise of these movements was a threat, and that was partly true. But it's not the whole story. Remember, well, if you don't remember, the U.S. and NATO launched a series of airstrikes in Serbia in 1999, and the Americans dropped some bombs on the Chinese embassy, and they said it was a mistake. But what resulted from this were these huge anti-American riots in China. Now, this was something that the Chinese didn't have to tolerate. They could have cracked down on immediately. And nationalism is generally not something that's in the Chinese Communist Party's best interest. But a little nationalism to achieve policy goals was seen as a great thing. It's a credible signal that we're dangerous. We might have no choice. We, the leaders of the Communist Party, might have no choice but to respond. But the communists also tempered this. Too much would be dangerous for them. They'd risk chaos, they'd risk the rise of new elites, and so they ultimately tempered it. But the point here is that the Chinese, and we've seen this in China numerous times, especially with respect to their policy with Japan, where they've actually fomented this Chinese nationalism against the Japanese during periods of conflict to show that that they can speak for their population and their hands are tied, and so the Japanese better watch out, because they might have to do things that they quote-unquote don't want to do. Well, the same thing was going on in Central Asia. Communist Party elites saw some of these things as harmless or even potentially beneficial, these nationalist movements, because they could be used to demand more resources from the center, from Moscow, which would in turn make them more popular. Perestroika had changed the economic terms of the Soviet Union by this point, and redistribution, which used to be roughly based on need, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, was now based along economic principles. The highest rate of return would get the most money back. And this wasn't Central Asia because of the way the economy was structured due to the Tsarist period and then the Soviet period, where it was all based on these raw goods for the most part. Now, informal groups were used to show that they still have heavy needs in Central Asia and that they still need state resources. So local Communist Party elites would take this to Moscow and say, hey, if you don't help us out, we face political instability. So, for example, ecological groups, environmental groups, brought new attention on regional problems like the Aral Sea, which then the Communist Party elites from the republics could use to make new demands for resources from Moscow. So from this perspective, these groups could be sort of manipulated, not necessarily the groups being manipulated, but their agendas could be manipulated and used by local party elites to get more from Moscow, which in turn would advantage them and help them defeat these elites, ironically. But they were also seen simply as a threat. Participants were accused of taking advantage of political change to destabilize the republic and destabilize the Soviet state to gain power for themselves, so they were condemned as antisocial. So there was this sort of two-level game that these elites were playing. Now, in practice, critics were frequently dismissed by authorities. They were called apologists for the past. They were looked at as pan-Turkics. They were labeled advocates of linguistic chauvinism, when in fact, linguistic chauvinism had historically come from the North. This whole Soviet man was based on the Russian prototype. But that's how they were being condemned. Because remember, the Soviet man was this international, as in a republic, creature. And now these people were demanding these national, so ethnic-based claims So incumbents continued to warn against glamorizing the pre-colonial period. They continued their attacks on Islam in order to try to win the upper hand over these nationalists. They also denied opposition's claims and said they actually have adequate resources to deal with all the things that the nationalist movements were advocating for. For example, they claimed that the Uzbeks were getting adequate compensation for their cotton. This was one of the things. Cotton was being sold for below market prices, and the Uzbek nationalists and these opposition movements were demanding higher prices. And the communists were saying, actually, we're getting plenty of money. They said, actually, the Aral Sea issue isn't so important. It's just a source of populism for the opposition. So they were playing down these things at home at the same time that they were playing them up, actually, in Moscow. It's another important thing here is that censorship, well, didn't entirely disappear in Central Asia. There was much more freedom during this time in the late 1980s, early 1990s, to publish otherwise once unthinkable things. So really, the local communists were gritting their teeth and obeying Moscow on this. They didn't like the glasnost policy, but they were going along with it, and they were afraid a lot about what was going to happen as a result. So I'll take a new set of slides here.